Hello, my name is Joan Hands on this Thanksgiving Day, November 25th, 2010. I'm sitting here with my grandma, Mrs. Joan Hands, who has joined us from the United Kingdom, and we are going to discuss some family history, beginning with her early life. Hello, Nan. How are you?
Good morning, Joe. I'm fine, thanks.
Lovely. Great to see you. Great to see you here.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, very happy to have you.
Thanksgiving in America.
Yes, very good. So, alright, let's get this started with some simple background questions. So, when and where were you born?
Well, I was born on the 9th of April, 1940. So I was what you call a war baby. And I was born in Thornton Heath, Croydon, Surrey. And that's part of the Greater London conurbation. And during that period, of course, the war had started. And so I was born during the beginning of the Second World War.
So you weren't actually born in the city of London, you were born like around the Greater London area.
That's
so
right.
The urban area, kind of like how we're close to New York City.
That's right.
Alright. So how did your family actually come to live in that area?
Well, it's a long story, but my mother's parents lived in Leicester, the city of Leicester, which is about 100 miles north of London, and my grandfather was working in the shoe factories because Leicester was famous for that, and that's where my mother was actually born. But then he got a job in London, and so they all moved down there, and that's where my mum was living when she met my father. And it's rather a strange story how they met. They were both cyclists, and they were on their cycles at a red traffic light when suddenly, when the light changed, their handlebars crossed and they fell off in front of each other. And so that's how they met. And from then on, of course, they got engaged, they got married, and then they lived in...
That's a nice story. That's nice. So, the house you lived in as a child, what was it like?
Well, I don't remember anything about the house in Croydon because I was 9 months old when we left there.
Right.
The war had started, the bombs were being dropped. I was out in my pram in the garden, and the street behind us was bombed. My mum got really scared, and so she packed her bags. My father had been called up, so he was already in the forces, in the RAF, and my mum decided to go back to Leicester, to where she'd been born. So that's where we spent most of my childhood. That's where I grew up for 20 years in Leicester City.
Huh. So you mentioned about how the Second World War, the bombing of the planes in your area, had several effects on your family. Can you describe what would happen actually during those times and the responses of your family and such?
Yeah. Well, as I said, my father was called up. He went to North Africa, to Durban, and then to Egypt, and I did not see him for 4 whole years. He came over once, I think, on leave, and that was all. So he was a mystery to me. But living in the house in Derwent Street, Leicester, were the uncle whose house it was, my gran and granddad who'd moved with us, myself, my mother, and later on, when Dad came home on leave, my little baby brother was born 9 months later, and so it was quite a big family in a small terraced house in the back streets of Leicester.
So since your dad was so active in the war, you actually didn't see him much as an early child. So what exactly did he do in the war?
Well, he was in the RAF, and he was part of the supply system for the airfields. I don't really know much about it because although he came back and brought back a kit bag full of all his mementos, he never really spoke a lot about it. I have a little photograph album at home in England that shows some of his camps and some of the vehicles, etc. But I don't really know a lot about what he did. But I do remember an awful lot about living in Leicester in those early days.
Okay, well, we'll get to that in a bit.
Yeah.
But when planes would actually, Leicester you were living in when there was bombings going on during the war, what would your family actually do in the event of a German bombing of the area?
Well, my earliest memory as a baby was being in the understairs cupboard, which was where we kept our food, a pantry. But the whole lot of us would go in there and hide when the air raid siren went until the all clear signal came. And I remember my mum, dressed in a red dressing gown, going out to the kitchen to heat up some milk for me. So I couldn't have been more than about 1.5 to 2 years old then, but that is my very first memory. And then in the street itself, we had this huge brick air raid shelter. So there was enough room inside it for half the street families to go inside when there was an air raid. And the man next door to us, he was an air raid warden, so he had a special uniform and he would have to go around and check that the houses were not showing any lights. We had blackout curtains, and I well remember those because it made the house very gloomy. We had every window had a big black curtain, and you weren't allowed to show a single chink of light.
To disorient the bombers that would come over.
Yeah.
And so how often would they actually have an air raid, and how often would this whole scenario occur?
Well, in Leicester, because of the factories, there were quite a few bombs on the inner city area. We used to go around in the next day and pick up shrapnel, the pieces on the bomb sites. So I reckon not as much as in the Blitz in London, but it was quite a regular occurrence. And the neighbouring city of Coventry was heavily bombed, and the cathedral was just in ruins, and all the medieval centre of Coventry was just ruined, which was such a shame.
Yeah, that is. So you mentioned your earliest memories, and we talked about how you were affected by the Second World War, the bombings and the air raid. So what about your educational life? What was it like going to your first school you ever went to?
Well, I think I'd like to go back a bit even from that, because again, before I went to school, we were affected by shortage of food and clothing. So there was a thing called the British Restaurant, and this was a big canteen where you could go and get a very cheap dinner or use your coupons. Everybody had ration books and they had to spend coupons. They were only allowed a small amount of butter, a small amount of meat a week, sugar, tea. It was all rationed. So my mum, my little baby brother Eric and I would have to walk over the hill where the big park was, right down to where this British restaurant was. And then you had to queue up, and then you had to give in your coupons, and then you went into this big canteen. And the smell was awful. It was like stale cabbage and leftover food smell.
And would there just be one of these for every city, or one or a couple spread out, or just?
Each district had its own restaurant.
So it would only be one. It would be very crowded.
It was very crowded. You had to queue for a long while.
And your average coupon, what would that get you in a pantry like this?
About £1/4 of butter a week and so on. But for the canteen, it bought you a meal. And the custard was made with dried milk powder. I always remember the taste of that. In fact, I didn't like real custard after the war because I got so used to having powdered custard. And you had big steamed puddings and, steak and kidney and, really good healthy food, filling food.
Right.
All the children were given an allowance of orange juice and cod liver oil because that was to help us to keep our vitamins up and our growth up. So we actually were quite healthy.
So even despite a lack of food amongst the public, you were still able to get on with these rations and all that.
You had something to eat. And then of course there were the rabbits. My grandmother's sister had come over from India and with her 3 children, and they had rented a house nearby, and it had a big downstairs garage area, and they kept chickens and they kept rabbits. So we had plenty of food because we had eggs from the chickens. We had, I used to get chased. Her 2 sons used to kill the chicken to eat, and then chase me round the garden with the chicken claws. If you pull the tendons, the claws were still open like this. And one day, they'd cut off the head of this chicken ready to kill it to eat for dinner, and the darn thing kept running round and round the garden still after me without its head.
One of those headless chickens.
Murder. It was awful. But we had food,
So what we're getting at here is that even you learn how to ration your own food and store your own food during a wartime. Did you have a garden where you'd plant vegetables and?
In Leicester and Derwent Street, they weren't really gardens; they were backyards. But everybody grew everything they could wherever they could, and we had big allotments on the outskirts of the city. So we'd go on the bus, and we would go to the allotments, and we would pick food for free because there were blackberries in the hedgerows, so we would go blackberrying, we'd go mushrooming in the fields. You just did everything you could to get food from anywhere.
And so that would kind of, you wouldn't have to go to these pantries as much if you had all of these vegetables and your own sustainability, or would you still go to the pantry anyway just to get what you could? Yeah, the English restaurant.
Yeah, no, we did a bit of mixture of both, really.
Right.
So that was, the food situation. Apart from the going to the my uncle's and aunt's place for the chickens and the rabbits, before I went to school, my memories really are of the park. It played a very big part in my life. It was just at the top of the street. It was called Spinney Hill Park, and it was several acres big, and it had wonderful places where you could play hide and seek and hide in the bushes and make dens. And because it was wartime, there were no park keepers, so there was nobody to chase you off and say you couldn't do this or you couldn't do that. And there were wonderful swing yards with great big seesaws and witches' hats where you sort of had a triangular shaped metal structure and it went round and you push yourself round on it. So life was pretty good, really.
Oh, right. So, and even you did have these things there, and and it sounds like you had fun back then.
We did.
But did the war actually bring on any negative? Like, well, of course it would have had to have brought negative effects. But was there damage in the area where you were? Were there?
Yes, factories were bombed, houses were bombed. Not anything in Derwent Street, thank goodness. But as I said, we would walk. We walked a lot in those days. You didn't have cars. Right. We used the local buses, and as you went on the bus ride into town, there'd be bomb damage. So it was just part of growing up. We didn't really understand it much. But when Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, came, that was a great event because the whole street put on a street party. So this is about 100 houses.
Right.
And they had tables down the middle of the street. There wasn't much traffic in those days.
Oh, no, of course not.
And everyone brought out whatever bits of food they could find. People made cakes, people made puddings, jellies, blancmanges, and all the children were treated, and everyone came out and we danced in the evening. Somebody brought out a piano and had it outside the house. And
so you must have enjoyed yourself as well.
I really, really did.
You were how old during that?
I must have been about 5 years old.
But still, you remember it quite well.
I do.
Great. And how long after that did you see your father?
Well, he came home when he was demobbed at the end of the war, and when he came home, he brought, as I said, a kit bag full of his uniform and his badges and everything. I've still got some medals, which I'll show you later, well, pictures of. And very foolishly, I took this kit bag with all his bits in it and a beautiful pearl necklace he brought me back from Africa up onto the park, where some older boys came and they stole it from me and they took everything. So I was very, very ashamed when I went home.
So you never saw those again?
I never saw any of it again, no, including my beautiful necklace. So there you go. You live and learn.
Some good things and bad things always happen during life. So
schooling, you asked.
Yes, we can go back to that. Yeah.
So I started school when I was 5 years old at the local infant school.
Was that after VE Day or before it?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure how old, which month I started, but it was in the year in which I had my 5th birthday. And the first class was like your kindergarten, and we had our own little towel, toothbrush, tooth mug, peg, and it all had a symbol on it, and mine were a bunch of cherries, because they didn't think we could read our own names, so we had little pictures to show us where our things were. And so hygiene was part of it.
Right.
We had camp beds that we went to sleep on.
So you actually got nap time in school?
We had nap time
that's
school.
Nice.
We had a sandpit outside, a sand tray inside. We had a playground. But if you can picture this, it was a Victorian school. So it's big, high brick walls with broken glass on the top to stop people getting in or us getting out, I don't know which. And it was all a 3-story brick building.
So was it a bit scary actually going to school? Yeah.
It was like going into a prison actually. But from day one I loved it. I really loved school. But then I noticed that the children that made a fuss got the best toys to play with.
Oh.
So after about 2 weeks, I decided I would try this. And parents didn't come into the classroom in those days.
No parental observation, it was strictly independent?
No, not at all. They left you at the gate, and after a while you walked to school on your own, age 5, you know. It was the done
Well, you
thing.
can do that in England. It's all very close.
So this day I decided I would scream blue murder. So I did. And of course I then got to choose the best toy to play with, which was the dearest little cooker with all the little pots and pans in green and cream. I can see it now, and I just loved it. I thought, this is good. But I didn't do that too often.
So it kind of taught you some more negative things. It's like if you complain and cry and scream, you're gonna get what you want.
I think it did.
Might have been a little bit of neglect from the teacher's perspective.
But I did love school, and I learned to read at that school very quickly. Mum and Dad had brought me some Janet and John picture books and also some nursery rhyme cards. So by knowing the rhymes and decoding them against the words on the page, I learnt to read very early on, and I've always loved reading. And when we were in the top class, the teacher used to put out all the books on a table, and they were all colour-coded, and you worked your way up through the colours on the table. So I very quickly got to the top end of the table, and then I had books like The Gingerbread Boy and Mrs. Vinegar and all the lovely folk tales.
The early readers' books. All right, what were you trying to? All right, stop. We have to stop here because I don't know what they're doing.